Jerry and Maria, our LERN dancers. I see everybody's kind of staring out the window and saying, is that the sun? My gosh, it is the sun. People are legging in your little clothes. Good morning. Morning. Once again, my name is Jana Richie. I'm the chair of the LERN Board of Directors this year. It is my pleasure to introduce your presenter this morning. William A. Draves and Julie Coates are co-authors of the book Nine Shifts. For the past 20 years, Bill has been presenting annual Night Shift updates at our conference. They have also presented Night Shift at other conferences all around the world, and their discoveries have made national news 3 times. Presenting Night Shift for the very last time, please welcome Bill Draves.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thanks for being here. How many people have been to a Night Shift presentation before? Ooh, good. Thank you so much. For those of you who are first-timers, we'll give you a review of it. Welcome to the 21st century. Here's the story in brief over the next 45 minutes. We have just transitioned from the industrial age of the last century into the knowledge society of this century. In 41 days, in 2020, we will be in the first full year of the knowledge society. And so Nine Shift is the story of that transition from the old way of life into the way of life in this century. It's the story of LERN, and I'll tell you about that, but it's also what each one of your communities have gone through over the last 20 years, and life is entirely different today than it was just 20 years ago. So we're going to review all of that in 4 parts, and then celebrate the first year of the Knowledge Society. Well, exactly 100 years ago, we were moving from the agrarian society into the industrial society. In 1900, 50% of people lived on a family farm. And by 1920, that number had dropped significantly. Today it's down to 1 or 2% of the population. And people in the industrial age in the factory took over. Now in 1900, you basically had 2 classes of people. You had the rich people, and this is what the rich people wore. This is kind of a fun hat. I like doing this. Isn't that nice? Yeah. So this is actually my father's hat when he was in college. They wore that on Saturday night. If you haven't been into the student union lately, they don't wear this much anymore. But most people were not rich, and they wore the hat of the working man. And that was 98% of the people. But there was a small emerging class as that industrial age came into being. Both African American and white men in that emerging class wore the bowler hat as a symbol of the middle class. And that actually is what you have done over the last 100 years economically in your communities. That is, you were instrumental in growing the middle class. And that middle class took over, and it infused not only the workplace, but also how we lived. And so the industrial age took over our personal lives and also our values. And so it is no coincidence that 100 years after 1920, we are now celebrating the 100th anniversary of the National Football League. My favorite team, even named after the factory, The agrarian age, it was baseball. The idea was to go home, a perfect game, nobody went anywhere. That was the ethic of the family farm. In football, no. The idea was to move, to go places. And when I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a guy made it when he got a job in Southern California, and everybody applauded as he moved from Wisconsin into Southern California. 100 years ago, we have just gone through this enormous transition. And once again, there is a new class emerging in the internet, the knowledge society. We call those people knowledge workers. And once again, that new class is evolving and coming into being. Now, you see up here where I say game over. What we mean by that is, let's go back 100 years ago. If you went into a high school in 1920, if you went into that high school in 1900 and said, what do you want to do? They would say, I want to work on the family farm or own the family farm. If you went into the high school in 1920 and said, would you rather own the family farm or would you rather make 10 cents an hour in the factory and have to live maybe in the suburbs? And 90% of the kids would say, give me the 10 cents an hour in the factory, give me the suburbs. And so 100 years later, today, right now, you go into high schools or colleges and say, would you like to live in the suburbs and drive an SUV to the office? Or would you want to work from home and live downtown and have to take the light rail? And 90% of the kids will say, give me the light rail, I want to live downtown. That's what we mean by game over. And so not everything is done by 2020. History doesn't work that way. In 1920, we still had horses. FDR had to kill the cavalry in 1939. The military thought they were going to go after Hitler with the cavalry, and FDR had to say, no, we're not doing that. My co-author, Julie Coates, grew up in the 1950s and walked behind her grandfather behind the mule. But basically, we're game over. And that's led to 9 shifts. You have them in your conference book and in your free copy of the book. Shift number 1, people work from home. That's done. We got it. People want to work from home. Shift 2, internet's replaced offices. LERN, we counted, uses 10 different intranet tools for our organization. You use others for yours. Shift number 3, networks replace pyramids. Shift number 4 is my favorite shift. Yes, I can almost hear the sounds right here from Paradise Hotel. Yes, light rail and trains will be the primary transportation in this century. Safer, faster, save the world. Shift number 5, dense neighborhoods replace suburbs. That's going on here and all around the country. Shift number 6, the rich get poorer. When I said country, I mean advanced societies, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, etc. We're still working on shift number 6 here in America, but they're working on it even better in Europe. Shift number 7, cheating becomes collaboration. There's a change in values going on. Shift number 8, half of learning is online. Shift number 9, education becomes web-based. Bottom line, life is better for our children and grandchildren than it was for us in this century. And so as we move, We've moved very quickly, just 20 years. Your grandchildren will say, how did you do that? One day there's Facebook, one day there's not, one there's YouTube. And so 75% of life have changed just within 20 years, and that's what 9 shift means. 9 out of your 12 discretionary hours in the day are spent differently for a young person today than 20 years ago. My assistant on the LERN staff has a son, 17 years old. He read 9 shift and he said nothing new there, and that's exactly right. If you're 17, nothing in that book is new, but it was all different in 2000. Now, not all of life has changed in 2020. In 2020, we are still reading books. We're still going to church, synagogue, or mosque. We're still watching Dancing with the Stars. But 75% of life has changed in just that small little bit of time. And so our story of investigation and LERN started in 1995. The chair of the board of LERN came to me and said, Bill, they've just invented this thing called the internet, and I want you to look into it. Within a year, we had decided to go virtual as an organization. And the 3 things that influenced our work was, 1, the invention of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee. Number 2, our son Willie, and then we discovered, lo and behold, other kids were acting very differently, and we had no idea what was going on. So Willie was, I think, in middle school, and he comes home from school and he tells me about Jenny Fredrickson, the last person who could write cursive. And I'm looking down at him. Now I'm looking up at him, but I was looking down at him and I was going, what? You can't write cursive or read it? And he said, well, I can write my name, but that's about it. And it turns out cursive is totally useless in this century. And so that's when I switched from what to why. He had a huge influence in teaching Julie and me about the 21st century. And then the third one was the history. We went back and looked at what happened 100 years ago, both in fiction and then also in our personal families. The photo on the right is my grandma in 1917 out there having the picnic. And so this story is about LERN, but it's also about your programs and about your communities. Lesson number 1, if you know any old people, go talk with them. They have amazing stories. You got to listen for a little bit while, but they got amazing stories, and that is something to do. And so we looked back 100 years ago and predicted that the same thing would happen once again, and that's how our predictions were made and why they came true, because we're going through that same economic transition that we went through 100 years ago. Well, in 1995, we were headquartered in Manhattan, Kansas. We had a big office building about the size of this and 30 people, and we were all happy and moving along. But in order to gain residency in the state of Kansas, I don't know if you know this, but you have to take a class on the Wizard of Oz. So we signed up for our class on the Wizard of Oz, and it turns out that the Wizard of Oz was written in 1901 by L. Frank Baum. And Baum lived in an agrarian age, and that was the height of civilization, of language, and all of that. And he saw that his beautiful society was going to be destroyed It was being destroyed by the industrial age. He didn't have a name for it, didn't care, but he created the Tin Man and the Lion and the Scarecrow to represent the virtues of that beautiful agrarian age. And he said his story in Kansas. He had never been to Kansas before, but just 10 years earlier, this New York newspaper man, Horace Greeley, said, "Go west, young man." And back then, people actually believed New York journalists. And so 1 million to 1.5 million people moved to Kansas within 10 years. And he said, even in Kansas, that awful transition is taking place. 100 years later, we are again going through that awful transition. We have just completed that awful transition. The driving force of the last century of the industrial age was the automobile. That's what led to all sorts of things, including women's right to vote. The World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee is the driving force today. Now, if you want to know how life has changed, don't go to Bill Gates' house, don't go to Silicon Valley. Where you want to go is Kansas. So we're living in Kansas, and I have a brother in Texas, and he sees this brochure from a department store in 1907 from Kansas. So he sends it to Julie. It's only $1. Julie shows it to me, and I'm amazed that there is a department store in Frankfort, Kansas, because this dust town is only 2 blocks long. There's a convenience store that is a convenience store, gas station, youth center, senior center, all about the size of the stage, so that there was a department store that 100 years ago I had to find out. And so I called on my off day on Saturday. I called Frankfurt. Nobody answered. I called the police station answering machine. Apparently you can't commit a crime over the weekend. Finally get a hold of someone and they say, yeah, the library's open this afternoon, all the way from 1 o'clock right up till 3 o'clock. So I schedule my arrival in Frankfort, Kansas, and I walk into the library and I meet the librarian, June Warren. Now, June has not had a customer service class, so it takes a little bit of while to get her talking. But June, I said, I'm here to find out about the department store that was here 100 years ago. And June says, which one? I'm amazed. This is a dust town of 400 people, and they had more than one. I said, tell me about Frankfurt. Well, there were 2 banks. The bankers were millionaires. There was a train that you could take to New York, not nonstop, but you could get on it. There was an African-American community, all sorts of other things going on there. I've never seen this many people in the streets of Frankfurt as there were in 1900. This is the brochure, the finest clothes on earth. Probably there was not a store in San Diego that had more than that department store, Elliger Brothers, in Frankfort, Kansas. They had a bicycle factory. They had a telephone switchboard. I said, June, this is an amazing place 100 years ago. How far would you have to go to find another town with a millionaire banker and an opera house? And she thought half a second, she said 11 miles. Blue Rapids, Kansas had 1. And that's when the lights went on, and I knew that the internet was changing our society, because everybody lived not necessarily in small towns like Frankfurt, but on family farms all around Frankfurt. And then she showed me this picture. This is 1909, and these are the first automobiles on the streets of Frankfurt. They had automobile caravans that went all across the country to show small town people what it was like. Within 10 years, Frankfurt went into serious decline because people could not sustain life on a 40-acre, 80-acre farm after they invented the automobile, because they also invented the tractor, which could plow 300 1,000, 10,000 acres. And so Frankfurt and all of those towns across Canada and the United States went belly up. And so we then, with all of that, decided to go virtual in 1998. And we came up on the year 2000, the new millennium, and we were all ready to celebrate because we knew what was going on. But in the United States, there was two things going on in 2000. There was Y2K. All the computers were supposed to blow up and the planes would fall down from the skies on January 1st. And then there was terrorism. So the only safe place in America was in your basement, and that's where Americans went, and there were no celebrations anywhere. So we got on the big plane and we went off to London, England, to celebrate the new year. We were there in London on the New Year's Eve, and they had terrorism there too. And they phoned in and said, we're going to blow up the big celebration. And the Queen said, no, I'm going to the celebration. Screw the terrorists. And back then, the Queen was really old. So I said, man, if the old Queen is going to do it, we're going to do it. So we went down by the Thames River and we experienced the largest fireworks display in human history, 2.5 million people. And then we stayed home and woke up the next morning, and I went out onto the streets of London, and it was all different. And they were, you could see it on the billboards. The top 3 billboards in London, England, in January 1st, 2000. One was very traditional, ring out the old, click in the new. Another one was, a little Iowa humor. If we build it, they will.com. And the third one was my wife's favorite, is a woman in bed with a laptop, shop until you drop off. Indeed, we have moved into the new era. Well, this is my family after my father passed away around 2000. On the left-hand side is my brother and his family. And then in the middle, on the right-hand side, is our son Willie, and he was in middle school. The woman there is my mother, and she's the matriarch of the family, and you have family dinners, and then you have conversation. So she gets the conversation going, and she turns to Willie and says, Willie, I hear you're in confirmation class. And Willie goes, yeah. And she goes, what are you reading in confirmation class? And Willie goes, Leviticus. And she goes, oh, that's interesting. What's your favorite passage from Leviticus? And Willie says, thou shalt not seize thy neighbor's ass. And the entire table erupts with laughter, except for my mother's going, that's not what it means. That's not what it means. And so my mother and my son had the same name, the same genetic code, the same morality, and yet they were separated by 3 centuries. My mother understood the horse and the mule as an economic thing. She heard the clip-clop of the horse on the streets at 5 in the morning. My son has a screensaver, but that's about it. And so, as we change into this new century, values change and attitudes change because they have to adjust to the new century. Part 2, the 5 things you still don't know about the 21st century. I told Julie 10 years ago, everything's happening, nobody will be interested in night shift. And she said, no, they still won't know everything. So here's the 5 things that impact your program. Number 1 is called the Knowledge Society. It's not the internet age, the information age, the gig economy, the whatever. The term was invented by Peter Drucker. He lived in San Diego, and he invented it 60 years ago. And the Knowledge Society is the term that explains and describes what we're doing here in work and in life. And so even today, we are not even measuring the Knowledge Society. All our measurements are old based on the last society. The core of the Knowledge Society is a knowledge worker. A knowledge worker works with something that's intangible. And a good example of a knowledge worker would be, oh yeah, you guys, you're all knowledge workers. And that is the core economic of the new society. Number two, you will have to work from home. You're going, Draves, you don't understand. I work with the recreation department. We have pools, we have gyms. Yeah, you'll need people at the pools and gyms. But I am a taxpayer, and I know that if you have an office, you don't need that office. And in fact, taxpayers are paying 25% more for you to go to that office than to work from home. Plus, then we have to pay for the office. And so as society changes, business will understand this, and taxpayers will make sure that you work from home because you're working off of their dollar. You also, if you're a college, will have no idea how to serve the workplace if you're in an office and they're working from home, which is what they're doing right now. And so it would be like being a farmer and milking a cow and then trying to help somebody run a factory. Don't work. Number three, what is the percent of your community with a 4-year degree? You need to know this number. Again, Draves, I'm with the recreation department. We have nothing to do with that. Yes, everything you do has to do with this number, because you are the only people who can keep knowledge workers who have 4-year degrees in your community. And the percentage of people in your community with a 4-year degree is the economic prosperity of your community and the future of your community. And so that number is absolutely essential as a measurement of economic prosperity in your community. Number four, males and females learn differently. We heard about this a little bit in yesterday's sessions, that in the last century to treat people equally, we treated them the same. And you and I know not every person is the same. And I'm betting if you're teaching kids how to swim in a pool, you surely know not every kid is the same and has the same requirements, and you teach every kid the same how to swim. No, that's not how you do it. And so the overall thing is we are only starting to understand that people have different differences. And a big one is that your boys and girls, your men and women learn differently based upon gender. We could go into other things such as neurology and etc. There's other differences, but in this century, so every year we take a look at the year in review, and here we are in 2019. And so here's the top things going on in 2019. There's a scare about Russian interference in society. The economy is good, but there's no wage growth. There's low unemployment. There's great political division in the country. There's an epidemic of depression. There's a huge inequality in wealth. There's a shortage of housing in urban areas. There's a huge anti-immigration feeling in the country. Democracy is in danger, and after so much chaos in the last few years, people desire a return to normalcy. Oh wait, that was 1919. I'm sorry. There's 2019. Let me start over. Sorry about that. 2019. There's a scare about Russian interference in society. The economy is good, but no wage growth. There's low employment. There's great political division in the country. Yes, we are living in a time that was exactly the same 100 years ago, and you can look at those two books and get that same kind of parallel there. So, many times, Julie and I have been asked to speak about Nine Shift around the world, but then there's times when we've gone to cities that were pivotal 100 years ago in that whole shift. And so we've been to Moscow, Japan, Sydney, Paris, Vienna, London, looking at all the changes going on 100 years ago so that we could predict and see what the changes would be today. And so this year, we decided to go only 20 miles. We're right outside, we're in Wisconsin, but we're right outside of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. And so we went to those two cities. They are both in the 21st century. People are moving downtown. In St. Paul, they've just opened up the new train depot, which was the old train depot. And all of those things that we mentioned in Nine Shift are happening there in St. Paul. And in fact, just last week, the mayor of St. Paul, there was a Ford company, of course, a Ford plant there in St. Paul for the last century, and then they closed it and tore it down maybe 10 years ago. And last week, the mayor announced what they're going to do with that land, and it is multi-use offices, shops and stores, apartment buildings, walkways, solar energy. It is the community of the 21st century. There's no better comparison than that of the transition that we're just going through. But St. Paul was also on the cutting edge 100 years ago. In 1920, it was a literary center. And the last great novel about that transition from the agrarian age to the industrial age was written in 1920 by Sinclair Lewis, called Main Street, and it takes place in both St. Paul and a rural community. And then the first book of the industrial age, the 20th century, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was born and raised in St. Paul, and while it seemingly takes place on the East Coast, he ends up by saying that it does take place in St. Paul, and it's about Middle America as well as the coast. And so, so from those novels, we have learned much, and we can see that transition happening once again. The other thing I need to talk about in the year that we're in is an address about that, and you've heard it yesterday from Ken and other speakers, is the epidemic of depression, anxiety, and panic. And let me just, before I take you down a little bit, I am going to take you back up, but let me just give you the lesson. The moral of the story is what Julie Coates says, that every class that you offer is now a wellness class. You are the solution, not necessarily to the problem, but for people dealing with despair. And so there is this thing. I read this book 10 years ago, and it's a great book. It's exactly about 1919. And I tried to read it again, and it was so much about this year that I just couldn't. And I threw it down because we are in the middle of this thing, an epidemic of depression. So Julie and I mentor and counsel kids We've mentored and counseled about 18. Julie still is in touch and mentors 12 of them. Only 2 of them are our biological kids. The others we just call our kids. They text her at 3 in the morning, and she helps them through all sorts of issues that they're going through. 4 of them are African American, a couple of them are gay, 1 is heterosexual female, another is a transgender female, and Julie mainly does the work, and I'm right there just to be a help. The transgender woman calls me her TV dad, and I'm very proud of that. Just to be clear, it's a 1950s TV dad. It's not Homer Simpson, I think. Let me check on that. But anyway, I'm there to support her as she is mentoring and counseling these people. And over the last 18 months, we've had to go to the ICU unit at midnight, and 2 of our kids were there, not at the same time, in different hospitals, different places, within minutes of joining 100,000 other people and dying from what the CDC calls despair. And as a parent, it is a very difficult situation to be in. We are very lucky in that both of our kids survived, but there are 100,000 other people who don't survive. You could read about one of them just this morning. They are in different ages and all sorts of situations, but the bulk of them are white men in their 30s. And the bulk of those white men in their 30s are, from our experience, really, really intelligent, but they do not have a 4-year college degree. And if you know anything about the economics of this century, you understand why that is taking place. And so this 100,000 people a year, it doesn't get play in the media. It's there in the CDC statistics. It's there if you talk to mental health counselors. It's there if you talk to doctors. It's the highest it's ever been in U.S. history. It's doubled since 2000 and right now. And in the United States, it is actually lowering life expectancy. And so on a personal level, one of our kids had a friend named Franco. And Franco knew 3 languages. He loved his cello, and he always had a book. And he took his life a few months ago. On the right-hand side, another story is Mike. I had no relation. I read about this in the BBC, but Mike grew up in Wisconsin, graduated from high school, went to train with classical music, but his real brilliance was math. But he had no college degree, so there was nowhere for him to exercise or get a job with that math, even though we have a math shortage. It's called STEM, and we need those people. He was shut out. And so he became an internationally known poker player, and then donated all sorts of money to charities and everything. And he took his life about 6 months ago. And his sister right there giving him a hug is Ruth. And Ruth kept texting him even after he had passed. She was just grieving so much that she texted him almost every day. And then about a month ago, she got an answer. And it was from Amber in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And they had never met, but Amber knew what Ruth was going through, and they connected, and Amber helped Ruth going through her own grief. And so the societal and economic impact of this is just enormous. And so we're behind in college graduates, and business is screaming for college graduates. There's a huge STEM shortage. And then there's a merit shortage. They call it males not being qualified for marriage, and it's because they don't have a 4-year degree. And so the marriage rate is the lowest it's been in decades. And so, once again, the moral of the story is that you are part of the solution. So I was reading Tender is the Night. It's another amazing book by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it takes place 100 years ago, right after World War I. And there's an American in Europe, and this European said, how was you affected? How were you affected by the war? And the American says, oh, I wasn't at the front line. And the European said, everyone was affected by the war. And the deaths, 100,000 a year, that's the same as World War I. Over 2 years, we're getting closer to the death toll for Americans in World War II. And when I read that, I went, wow. Because yes, that's today. There are people in this room who are affected by this, who know people who are lost, know people who were saved. And there are people, I guarantee you, in every one of your programs who experience this. And so your classes are one of the big ways that people help grieve and people help heal. And that's why every one of your classes, doesn't matter what the subject matter is a solution, is a help for somebody out there grieving or needing to be healed. And please tell your instructors about that. And it's not all bad. Cricket, our kid who lost Franco, he lost 4 friends over the last year to death by despair. But he was walking down the street a month or 2 ago, and he found a girl lying face down on the pavement, and he saved her life. That's what the EMTs said. And so it's not all about loss. It is about saving people. It is about helping people recover. So we're in the ICU unit, or outside of it. You don't get to go in it. For one of our kids, and then the doctor comes in, and after a day or so, he's ready to release our kid who survived. And the doctor only does saving lives. That's all he does. So he's got this line, and he looks at our kid and says, I never want to see you again. And our kid shoots back, same to you, buddy, which made the doctor smile. And we knew our kid was going to be okay. This portion of the program brought to you by Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer. Pabst is not just for breakfast anymore. So on to the 21st century here. So last year I mentioned death by despair, and this woman said, oh, that was just too depressing. And I'm going, it's life, it's life. This is what we're living. I mean, you can read about World War I. Why can't you deal with this? And then I listened to this BBC program that explained the whole thing. And the whole thing is that only 6% of Americans think life is getting better. And if you go to India or China, they know life is getting better. But everybody here and most of the world are totally negative about the future. And then the BBC had this program, and Martin Seligman of the University of Pennsylvania said that 10,000 years ago there was an ice age. And there were some people who said, you know, it's a beautiful day, that ice age ain't coming. And then there were half the people who said it's a beautiful day, but the drought and the ice age and the starvation and the famine is coming, we better get ready. And it did, and all the people who are optimistic disappeared from the face of the earth. And so we're genetically wired to be negative about the future. And so then they said, well, is that still a good trait to have internally? And he said, no, because it eliminates the possibilities of solutions. And so Jana Richie says that basically all of us here in the room, when we look at a world picture and take a quiz about the state of the world, we're looking at it from the perspective of 50 years ago. So if we look at Thailand, we're all thinking everybody in Thailand is on the left-hand side of the picture. And there might be some people doing that. But basically, the right-hand side of the picture is what Thailand is today. And in fact, they gave tests to Americans and others, and monkeys scored better on those tests than Americans. Americans got one question right, and it was about climate change, and everything else, no. And so the world is getting better, and we need to be aware of that. Yesterday, 130,000 children escaped from poverty. That will happen today and tomorrow. Extreme poverty has fallen from 35% of the world's population in 1987 to under 11% today. That's 1 billion people. Child labor down 40%. In the U.S., teen births, smoking, violent deaths, homicide are all down. No, Draves, no more good news, please. Just a few more. More people live in a democracy now. Last month, they invented a new tuberculosis vaccine for the world's most lethal infectious disease. It's on track to save millions of lives. No more. Just 2 more. Last week, they developed a vaccine for Ebola. It's huge. And then last month, they discovered a new cystic fibrosis therapy that goes to the genetic root of the disease. That was such a huge breakthrough that the doctors were in tears. And so we are getting better. We do have to deal with climate change. But it is your and my job to deal with the possibilities, to deal with the solutions, to help our people understand the solutions, to educate them in any way we can about those solutions. And so we can do it. It is now one of our jobs. Moving forward, that's what we need to do. So I turned the page. I have this book on the right-hand side about a page for every year in the last century. And 1919 was awful. It was just a pit of a year. And then I turned the page to 1920, and everything gets better. And people are optimistic, and the wages go up, and all of this stuff happens. And so in the last 3 minutes here, I just want to say that this decade is going to be good, and we are going to see amazing changes for the positive in our world. In the last 3 minutes, I just want to do a few thank yous, since this is the last night shift. One, I do want to say we had a great bunch of fun. You guys showed up every year for 20 years, and we had skits, and we had songs, and we had music, and we had jokes, and we had dancing, and it was really cool. My cousin died this year, no sorrow. He was 78. He lived a great life. He had no regrets. You know, in the office, when somebody does something good and you say, "You're a rock star," yeah, he was a rock star. And in 1 year, his group sold more records than the Beatles and Rolling Stones combined. And when he looked back on his life, he said it was a wonderful ride. And that's what Nine Shift has been. It has been wondrous, it has been magical, it's been amazing to experience it, it's been amazing to predict it and then see those predictions come true, and all of those wonderful things. So I do want to, again, thank three groups of people. One, my family, William A. Draves the first, who was an entrepreneur. They called him an industrialist 100 years ago. He started a whole bunch of stuff. He started a car factory. It was steam, so it went nowhere. He started a beer company. The beer was so bad they had to rename it Bud Light. Everything he did was a failure. He only started one Fortune 500 company. And that one, of course, was a huge success. And I learned so much about him from his life and his generosity and his kindness. Obviously, our son, William A. Draves V, is so important in teaching us about the 21st century. My mother, and then I do want to thank my colleague, Julie Coates, for everything that she's done. She's been our lead researcher for Nine Shift, and her experiences, she's lived through three economic eras herself. She's lived through the agrarian age, where she was raised. She lived through the industrial age, and now she's on the other age of the internet society. So thank you so much for your role. We could give her a round of applause. Thank you. And then lastly, I want to thank you. Without you, there would have been no Nine Shift. With every year, somebody came up and encouraged me to do Nine Shift and to continue on that wonderful journey. And I want to thank you individually and as a group. And now we have 30 seconds left. We're actually right on schedule. I need you to stay in your seats. We have 30 seconds of exit because I want to go out dancing. And we also have game over buttons. So after dancers, Maria and Sherry go down the aisle, we'll have game over buttons for anybody there who wants a game over button. My name's Bill Draves. Have a great 21st century, everybody. Just stay seated 30 seconds. We gotta go dancing.